Do you know what's secretly fueling your sugar cravings? The answer might surprise you. Sugar. It's not just sweet, it's a silent saboteur of your gut health. Sugar isn't just a guilty pleasure, it's a hidden health hazard. Let's break the sugar cycle together and take control of our gut health.
Carbohydrates are macromolecules or components that are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen.
Carbohydrates are sometimes referred to as energy-giving foods. Sugar is a type of carbohydrates that provides us with energy. Sugar is not only sugar. Sugar is composed of the building blocks, and these are the monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are the simplest forms of sugar. So you have the glucose, galactose, and fructose. These are the most basic molecules of sugar. So whenever you will break down any carbohydrate, it will result to any of the three sugars. So among the three simple sugars, you find that glucose is the most used sugar in the body. This is where you find that the body requires it to function, such as when you go to work, you use energy which is drawn from the glucose molecule, and this is able to give you energy so that you can work. Let me give you a perfect illustration of how this glucose works in our bodies. I am sure you have ever seen a car. That car needs fuel so that it can move. Similarly, glucose is like human fuel. It depends on glucose so that it can perform the bodily functions such as growth, there is movement, or even when you go to work, you use energy. That energy is drawn from glucose molecules. We now move to the second class of carbohydrates, that is disaccharides. Now, an interesting fact, monosaccharides, and that is the glucose, fructose, and the galactose that you have mentioned in the simple sugars, cannot exist on their own physically. As the name suggests, they exist in pairs. Now let me vividly explain what disaccharides are. These are the simple sugars that exist in pairs. A good example of a disaccharide is the sugar that we normally buy from the shop or in the supermarket. It is composed of the simple sugar, that is glucose and fructose. That is, when you drink that cup of tea with sugar, this is what happens. Remember, it is a sucrose type of sugar. When that sugar goes through the digestive system, you find that it is broken into two simple sugar that can be absorbed by the body, because normally the sucrose type of sugar cannot be absorbed directly by the body. It has to be broken down to the simple sugars, that is glucose and fructose. Note that these disaccharides cannot be absorbed directly by the body. So they have to be broken down into the simplest form of sugars that we have talked about. Now let's dive into the third class of carbohydrates, and that is polysaccharides. As the name suggests, poly means a chain of. That means the simple sugars are conjoined together to form a chain, a long chain of molecules, and that is what we call a polysaccharides. A good example should be the starch that we know of, like let's say rice. Rice is a good example of polysaccharide, or any other form of carbohydrate, that is, let's say yam, maybe arrowroot. At this juncture, you now understand what is a polysaccharide. Polysaccharide is a building block of any carbohydrate. And a good example of a carbohydrate is starch, cellulose, and glycogen. Let's take a look at the sources of carbohydrates. We now have two sources of carbohydrates, that is the animal-based carbohydrates, and then we have the plant-based carbohydrates. Two sources. So let's take a look at the animal-based carbohydrates. You find that most of the carbohydrates exist in disaccharide form. We have talked of the disaccharide. They exist in two pairs of the simple sugars that we have talked about. And mostly you can source them from dairy products such as milk. And we have talked of the lactose in milk being a disaccharide. Now, you find that most of the carbohydrates are plant-based. We now have the plant-based carbohydrates, and they exist in two forms, and that is disaccharides and polysaccharides. Now, let's take a look at the examples of carbohydrates in plants. That is starch, cellulose. Now, they exist in two forms, and that is the disaccharides that we have talked about, composed of two pairs of the simple sugars. And now, polysaccharides. Let me talk about the disaccharides. So a good example of a plant that contains a disaccharide is sugarcane. This way we find sugar such as sucrose, or any fruit that has any sugar, including even the fruits that we eat. We now move to the other form of carbohydrates that exist in plants, and that is polysaccharide. A good example of a polysaccharide is starch. This is why you find foods such as sweet potatoes, yams, Irish potatoes, wheat, or any cereal. It has a form of starch. They contain starch as a form of carbohydrate.
So this is how sugar is being utilized in our system. So whenever you ingest a carbohydrate or energy giving food, so the crude form of the sugar is being introduced in the body. So after digestion, the sugar in form of starch or disaccharide are being broken down into simple sugar that can be absorbed in the body. So after that, these simple sugars are being absorbed in our body and are utilized to give us the energy that we can use to do various chores, work, and also growth. That is how sugar is basically absorbed. But take note, we cannot take the crude form of sugar as it is. For example, a disaccharide or a polysaccharide. For this case of starch, it must be broken down to simple sugars, which requires a process of digestion. So our system can only utilize the already simplified sugar in form of a monosaccharide to produce that energy. So in our system, this sugar, after they are being absorbed, they are not just used the way they are. So there is a quantity of maybe a certain energy that our system needs to carry out a specific function. So these energies are being broken down in some simple quantas or simple parts or simple just quantity the way it is. So whenever a sugar or food is burned in our system, the amount of energy being released is called a calorie. So calories, that's the quantity of heat energy or energy in general being released after the food is broken down in our system. So consider this: sugars or carbohydrates are the most preferred food of energy because they are simple and their calorific value is also high. So whenever we eat sugar, they're easily broken down in our cell to produce that calorie. Caloric is just a unit of energy being produced in our system. What happens if we take too much of the required sugar in our system? So as we all know that too much of something is poisonous. So for instance, if we consume a lot of sugar or carbohydrate in our system, there must be a side effect. So these are the possible side effect that can occur when we eat too much sugar in our system. First of all, too much sugar will cause the abnormal growth of gut bacteria. So for this case, you find that the pathogenic bacteria will outgrow the good bacteria in number, making our system or our gut to be prone for infection. Or because now we know that in the gut also there are some resources that this good bacteria requires for them to grow. So if we increase these resources beyond the limit, these good bacteria can be somehow turned from being good to pathogenic, because now the resources is many but the point of attachment can be small, so they can get in converted to become pathogenic, thus can make us ill. For example, there is a strain of E. coli, Escherichia coli, that was good bacteria, but due to excess or imbalanced gut microbiome, it changed from being good bacteria now to be harmful. Another thing that happens if we take too much sugar in our system, we have impairment of gut barrier. As we know that gut also take place in self mechanism system, defense mechanism system, whereby it's help us to fight against infection to our body. So when the sugar is more, now that barrier will be impaired in a manner that too much sugar will make it now to function not what was intended for it to do. For example, some infection like IBS and IBD, like inflammatory bowel syndrome and also irritable bowel disease, can be expected in our system. So we need to minimize the amount of sugar entering our system. Another problem is that if we take too much sugar in our system, there is obesity. So we know obesity is that uncontrollable weight gain. You find that a person gain excess weight, and that one can lead to other infection like maybe heartburn, then the GERD. The GERD is gastroesophageal reflux infection, which is bring about by unbalanced absorption of sugar in our system. Thus can also lead in some infection like chronic infection like ulcers and some abnormalities like cancers. Also, there are some possibility of cancers in the colon if we take too much sugar. For example, the colon cancer. Therefore, it is very essential and it is needed for us to maintain the level of sugar in our system to ensure that our gut is in a good state and functioning properly.